The discovery. The morning was unremarkable, wrapped in a chill that gnawed at bones and patience alike. Jane moved along the city streets as she always did, her feet carrying her to the alley she knew by heart, where trash bins lined up like soldiers in disarray. The damp air hung heavy, and the echoes of a sleepless city faded with the dawn. She was invisible to most, her life a series of moments passed in shadows. The world had not always been this way. Jane once had dreams, a family, a purpose. But life had a cruel way of unraveling the threads of hope. She learned to survive by becoming one with the city's hidden corners, by making peace with hunger and loneliness. Now, the streets were her home, and discarded leftovers were her sustenance. That morning, her hunger was especially sharp, gnawing at her insides with relentless insistence. She moved to the bins, her hands sifting through bags and scraps. But this time, there was nothing. A pattern she'd noticed recently. Less food, fewer discarded items. She was about to move on when a sound cut through the silence. A cry, faint and small, almost lost in the morning fog. Jane froze, her heart skipping. Her first thought was that she was imagining it. But then it came again, more insistent. A fragile sound, like the pleading of a small animal. She leaned closer to the bin, her breath caught in her throat. The cries were real. She began pulling bags aside, moving cautiously, the strange and fragile sound growing louder. And then, beneath a tangle of discarded trash bags, she saw them. 12 tiny babies, bundled together in a makeshift box, barely shielded from the cold. Her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. She counted again, her heart hammering against her ribs. 12. 12 newborns, helpless, abandoned among the trash. Panic surged within her. What was she supposed to do? She felt the weight of her helplessness, the crushing sense of responsibility bearing down. Her instincts told her to run, to find help, to scream if needed. But another part of her, buried and neglected for years, emerged. She couldn't leave them here. She couldn't walk away from 12 fragile lives tossed aside like waste. With trembling hands, Jane lifted the box, glancing around to ensure no one was watching. In the cold morning light, she felt an odd sensation of purpose, a feeling she hadn't known in years. She carried the box, her every step measured, as if a single misstep might shatter the precious bundle in her arms. Jane's only refuge was Liz. The slum they called home wasn't much, a tangled mess of shacks and makeshift homes where everyone had a story and no one judged. But Liz, she was the heart of the place, a woman of quiet strength who had taken Jane under her wing when no one else had cared. If anyone could help her now, it was Liz. The walk felt endless, and each corner, every shadow, filled her with dread. The fear of being caught, of someone seeing her with these children, tightened her chest. But she kept going, her resolve hardening with each step. When she finally reached Liz's door, she knocked softly, her heart pounding. Liz opened the door, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of Jane cradling the box. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a single look, Liz seemed to understand everything without a word being spoken. "Come in, girl," Liz said, her voice a rough whisper that carried the weight of experience. "What have you gotten yourself into this time?" Jane entered, and as soon as she stepped inside, she felt a sense of safety wash over her. Liz took one look at the tiny faces peeking from the box, and her gaze softened, though her expression was grave. She moved with a calm assurance, gently lifting each baby, inspecting them with a tenderness that belied her hardened exterior. "These babies didn't just end up here by chance," Liz said, her voice low. "Whoever left them had their reasons." A shiver ran down Jane's spine at Liz's words. She'd thought of life on the streets as unpredictable, chaotic, and ruthless. But this felt different. There was something dark and deliberate about these abandoned children. Jane couldn't shake the feeling that they were in the midst of something much bigger than they could understand. The babies needed food, warmth, and care, things that Jane could barely provide for herself. But in Liz's house, The impossible began to seem possible. Liz had a way of bringing a sense of calm into any storm. She moved swiftly, bathing the babies, feeding them with a mixture she improvised, and putting them to rest in old blankets she gathered from neighbors. While Liz worked, Jane sat in silence, watching, still numb with disbelief. Something inside her had changed in that moment when she'd found the children. She realized that, against all odds, she was invested in their survival. It was an unfamiliar feeling, one that both terrified and strengthened her. After settling the babies, Liz sat across from Jane, her eyes grave. "We need to find out where they came from, Jane. These babies weren't abandoned without reason." Jane nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of Liz's words. She hadn't considered what lay beyond the immediate shock of finding the babies. Where had they come from? Why would someone abandon so many infants? And why had she been the one to find them? "There's something off about this," Liz continued, her voice barely a whisper. "Babies don't just appear like this. Not here. Not like this." Jane felt a knot form in her stomach. The streets had shown her horrors, but nothing like this. Her instinct told her that these babies were more than just orphans. There was something dark looming behind their abandonment. As Jane and Liz cared for the children in the days that followed, a bond began to form between Jane and the infants. She'd never had children of her own, never thought she'd be worthy or capable of raising another life. Yet here she was, taking on the role of a protector, a guardian, even if she didn't fully understand why or how. Each day, Jane grew more attached. She found herself watching over them, cradling them to sleep, wiping away their tears. They were fragile, innocent beings in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. And for the first time in years, Jane felt a purpose, an unexplainable calling to protect these lives at all costs. Liz, too, seemed to feel a sense of urgency, a sense that time was running out. She began making inquiries, discreetly asking around the slum, hoping to learn anything about the children's origins. Her face grew more somber each day, her eyes reflecting the burden of the secrets she was uncovering. She wouldn't tell Jane much, but her silence spoke volumes. One day, Liz returned earlier than usual, holding an old newspaper in her hands. She motioned for Jane to sit beside her and laid the paper on the table. The headline read, "3 babies missing. Wealthy family offers reward." The words blurred before Jane's eyes as the gravity of the situation sank in. The missing children weren't orphans. They were the children of one of the city's most powerful men, a prosecutor known for his unyielding stance against organized crime. "These babies," Liz said, her voice low, "they were stolen, Jane, and whoever abandoned them didn't want them to be found." Jane's head spun as she tried to comprehend what Liz was saying. Kidnapping was one thing, but to abandon them afterward, it didn't make sense. But something about Liz's expression told Jane that this was only the beginning. Jane looked at the babies, their tiny faces peaceful in sleep, and felt a renewed resolve settle within her. This wasn't a matter of chance. It was a matter of fate. She couldn't let these children fall back into the shadows from which they'd been rescued. But what would she do next? The secrets we uncover. The days after discovering the truth were a haze of dread and vigilance. Jane could barely sleep, her thoughts racing with questions she could not answer. The babies she had found in the trash were more than the abandoned remains of someone's carelessness. They were a mystery, and the more she learned, the more dangerous that mystery became. Liz kept her inquiries discreet, but Jane could tell by the lines deepening on Liz's face that she was getting closer to something serious. Every day, as Liz ventured out, Jane stayed behind, watching over the babies with an intensity that both surprised and worried her. For years, she had felt disconnected from the world, like an outsider looking in. But these infants had pulled her into their orbit, and now they were her whole world. One late evening, Liz returned, her expression shadowed by a revelation that seemed to have aged her overnight. She held out a piece of paper to Jane, a crumpled photo she'd managed to pry from someone's hands after hours of careful questioning. It was an old photograph of a family, a man and woman standing proudly with 2 children by their side. The prosecutor, Liz murmured, her voice tense. This is his family. Jane took the photograph with trembling hands, studying the faces staring back at her. There was an eerie resemblance between the children in the photograph and the babies lying asleep in the next room. It was unmistakable. These children belonged to that family, no question about it. But why would someone take them? Jane asked, her voice barely above a whisper. And why throw them away? Liz hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. I heard a story, she finally said. Rumors that the prosecutor wasn't just making enemies with criminals. He was part of something larger, something dark. People are saying he was involved in something he couldn't control, and those children were the price he had to pay. Jane's stomach twisted. She didn't know much about the world of power and influence, but she understood danger. And this was a level of danger she hadn't been prepared for. What do you mean? Something dark. Jane pressed, her voice wavering. Liz looked away, her eyes distant. Power has a price, Jane. Sometimes people are willing to pay anything to keep it, even if it means sacrificing others. The word sacrifice hung heavy in the air, and Jane felt a chill run through her. These were innocent children, yet they had become pawns in a game she couldn't even begin to understand. And now she was holding the pieces in her hands, responsible for their safety. Liz sighed and leaned back, exhaustion etched into her face. We need help, Jane. More than I can give, and more than you can handle alone. There's someone I know, someone from my past. He's not the kind of man you'd want to trust easily, but he's got connections in places we don't. If anyone can help us find a way to protect these babies, it's him. Jane's heart sank. The idea of involving someone else, someone with his own motives, filled her with dread. But as she looked at the babies, curled up together in blankets, she knew they couldn't do this alone. Liz's plan was their only option. When can we meet him? Jane asked, the decision settling heavily in her chest. Tomorrow, Liz replied. But Jane, remember, this man isn't doing this out of the kindness of his heart. He'll expect something in return, and it won't be cheap. The weight of Liz's words lingered in Jane's mind as she lay awake that night. The thought of involving strangers with murky intentions left her feeling raw, but she had to do it for the children. She was in too deep to turn back now. These babies had no one but her, and despite everything, she couldn't abandon them. The next day, Jane followed Liz through the winding alleys of the city until they arrived at a small, dimly lit bar tucked away from prying eyes. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and murmurs of quiet conversation. The man they were meeting sat in the far corner, shrouded in the shadows cast by a dim lamp. George looked up as they approached, his eyes cold and assessing. He was an older man with a grizzled beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing. His hands were rough, and his posture spoke of a life lived on the edge. Liz, he greeted, nodding at her before his gaze landed on Jane. And this must be the woman you mentioned. Jane felt herself shrinking under his gaze, but she straightened her back, refusing to be intimidated. She had fought her entire life, and she wouldn't let anyone make her feel small now. Liz introduced them, her voice calm and steady. George, we need your help. This is a serious matter. George leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. I know it's serious, Liz, but you're asking for a lot. These are powerful people we're talking about, people who don't take kindly to meddling. Then why agree to meet us? Jane challenged, her voice sharp. He smirked, clearly unfazed by her tone. Because, Miss Jane, there's a lot I could gain from this too. This prosecutor isn't exactly a friend of mine. Let's just say he's stepped on one too many toes. I'd be doing the world a favor by exposing him. Jane didn't trust him, but she needed him. If he could help them get the children back to safety without alerting the prosecutor or his associates, then he was worth the risk. I have information, George continued, lowering his voice as he glanced around the bar. These children were part of an experiment, something tied to genetic research. I don't know the full extent, but I've heard whispers about a program that tries to enhance certain traits, intelligence, physical abilities, things that would make these children more than ordinary. Jane felt the floor drop out from under her. Genetic manipulation. Experiments on children. The very idea was abhorrent. Who would do that to children? She whispered, horrified. People with too much money and not enough morals, George replied bluntly. The prosecutor got tangled up in this mess, thinking he could keep it under control. But someone else had other plans. They took the children to get back at him, to send a message. Jane felt a sickening realization settle in her stomach. The babies she'd rescued weren't just abandoned. They were discarded because they were a liability, a loose end in a twisted web of corruption and greed. Liz cleared her throat, pulling Jane back from her spiraling thoughts. So, what do we do, George? How can we protect them? George leaned back, his expression contemplative. You need to stay hidden. Keep the children safe and away from any authorities. If you go to the police, they'll pin this on you. A homeless woman with no resources, showing up with kidnapped children. They won't believe you. But I can get you in contact with someone who has enough leverage to expose the truth. Who? Jane asked, feeling the weight of their situation pressing down on her. A journalist, George replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone with a reputation for uncovering stories that others would rather keep buried. If we can get him involved, he can shine a light on this whole operation. Jane's heart skipped a beat. Going public would mean risking everything, but it was their best chance to ensure the children's safety. That night, Jane sat by the babies, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and resolve. Going to the press was a risk she hadn't considered, but she couldn't ignore the urgency in George's words. These children needed someone willing to expose the truth, to bring their plight to light. In the morning, George arranged for them to meet with the journalist. Jane and Liz waited anxiously in a secluded spot, clutching the babies close. The journalist arrived, a tall, thin man named Sam, his expression one of steely determination. He listened intently as Jane recounted everything she had learned, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Sam didn't interrupt, his eyes narrowing as he pieced together the narrative. When she finished, he leaned back, folding his arms. This is explosive. If what you're saying is true, this could be the story of the decade. It is true, Jane replied firmly. These children are proof. They were taken, manipulated. They deserve justice. Sam nodded, a faint smile flickering across his face. You're a brave woman, Jane. Most people would have turned away. But you chose to protect them. Jane felt a pang of pride mixed with sorrow. She hadn't chosen this life, but she had chosen to fight for these children, and that choice had become her purpose. Sam assured her that he would investigate discreetly, gathering evidence to build a case that would expose the entire operation. It was a dangerous move, one that could put all of them at risk. But Jane felt a glimmer of hope. Finally, there was someone willing to take on this fight with her. The following days were tense. Jane kept a low profile, watching the babies constantly, waiting for the day Sam would bring them news. She was torn between fear and anticipation, each day a countdown toward a reckoning she could barely imagine. And then, one evening, Sam arrived with a look of urgency. He held out a file, his hands trembling slightly. It's bigger than I thought, he whispered, his voice barely audible. This goes all the way to the top. Politicians, law enforcement, they're all involved. But I have enough to blow it wide open. Jane felt a surge of hope. This was it, the chance to finally bring justice for the children, to protect them from those who saw them as mere experiments. But Sam's next words shattered her relief. They know you have the children, Jane. They're coming for you. In that moment, Jane knew their battle had only just begun. They had exposed a monstrous truth, but now they were in the crosshairs of a powerful enemy. She held the babies close, her heart pounding. The only option left was to run. The great escape. The night Sam delivered the news felt like the first rumble before an earthquake, a small warning of something much larger and more dangerous to come. They had exposed the truth, or a sliver of it, but at a cost Jane could feel in her bones. She hadn't slept in days, her nerves stretched thin as she prepared for whatever might happen next. The babies, oblivious to the danger, lay bundled together in a corner of Liz's cramped room, their tiny faces peaceful as they slept. It was a fragile peace that Jane knew could shatter at any moment. "Jane, listen to me," Sam whispered, his voice low and urgent as he paced back and forth, clutching the dossier he'd assembled. "They know you have the children. They know you're a threat. And believe me, they will stop at nothing to silence you." Jane's heart pounded. She knew the risk, but hearing it from Sam's lips made it feel real in a way that left her reeling. "What are we supposed to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam stopped pacing and looked at her with a fierceness that surprised her. "You need to disappear, Jane. Get as far away as possible. I'll keep pushing the story, try to get it out there fast enough to put the spotlight on them. But you need to survive. You need to protect those children." "Where can we go?" Jane asked, desperation lacing her words. She was a homeless woman with nowhere to run, no resources, and no connections beyond the few people she trusted in the slum. "We don't have anywhere safe." Sam hesitated, glancing at Liz, who had been listening silently from the corner of the room. Liz's face was shadowed, her eyes full of resolve. "There might be a place," she said finally. "A friend of mine. She has a cabin out in the countryside. It's isolated, barely anyone knows about it. It's not much, but it'll buy you some time." Jane's hope flared, tentative but real. "Would she help us?" Liz nodded. "I've known her for years. She's been through her own share of hard times and knows what it's like to live on the fringes. If anyone can help you disappear, it's her." Sam's jaw tightened, and he looked from Liz to Jane. "You'll need to leave tonight. Don't take anything you don't absolutely need. The less trace you leave, the better." Jane swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. It was their only choice, she knew that, but the reality of it was daunting. She had no experience running, no idea how to stay off the grid, and these children depended on her entirely. "We'll do it," she said finally, her voice firm. "Just tell us what to do." The hours leading up to their departure passed in a blur. Liz gathered supplies, a few bottles of milk, blankets, and a small stash of food. Sam gave Jane an old phone, loaded with a burner SIM card, and a map detailing the route to the cabin. He explained that he would continue his investigation, keeping Jane updated as best as he could without risking their location. As the city descended into darkness, Jane and Liz carefully wrapped each baby in layers of cloth, cradling them against the chill. They moved in silence, communicating only through glances as they bundled the little ones into an old battered stroller Liz had managed to scavenge. It was worn and rickety, but it would allow Jane to carry the babies without drawing too much attention. Finally, it was time to go. Sam gave Jane a final look, his expression heavy with worry. "Be careful. I'll contact you if I uncover anything that might help, but you need to stay hidden. Don't trust anyone." Jane nodded, her throat tight with emotion. For the first time in years, she felt like someone cared, like she had allies in this fight. It was a strange feeling, one she barely knew how to process. Without another word, she, Liz, and the babies slipped out into the night, leaving the safety of Liz's home behind. The city felt like a different place under the cover of darkness, its streets unfamiliar and foreboding. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every corner a potential ambush. Jane's senses were heightened, her body coiled with tension as they moved through the deserted alleyways. After what felt like hours of walking in silence, they reached the edge of the city, where the concrete gave way to the rough terrain of the countryside. The air was colder here, sharper, and Jane shivered as she clutched the stroller, glancing at Liz for reassurance. "Just a little further," Liz murmured, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Once we reach the old trail, we'll be close." They walked for another hour, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath them. Finally, they reached a narrow path that wound through a dense forest, its canopy casting shadows that seemed to swallow them whole. Jane's heart pounded as they ventured deeper into the woods, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on her. She kept her eyes on the path, focusing on each step, each breath. After what felt like an eternity, they saw a small, dilapidated cabin tucked among the trees, its roof sagging under the weight of years and neglect. It was isolated, hidden from the world, a place that time seemed to have forgotten. Liz stopped, glancing at Jane with a reassuring nod. "This is it. It's not much, but it'll keep you safe." Jane released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Safe. The word felt foreign, elusive, yet here, in the solitude of the forest, she dared to believe it might be true. They stepped inside, and Liz quickly set to work, organizing their supplies and clearing a space for the babies to sleep. Jane followed, her hands trembling as she helped arrange blankets on the floor, creating a makeshift bed for the children. As she settled the babies down, she felt a surge of protectiveness, an overwhelming urge to keep them safe, no matter the cost. She didn't know where this instinct had come from. Perhaps it had always been there, hidden beneath layers of hardship and survival. But now, with these fragile lives depending on her, it surfaced with a fierceness she hadn't known she possessed. Liz sat beside her, her face softened by the dim glow of the lantern they'd brought. "Jane," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight Jane couldn't ignore. "You're doing something incredible. These babies, they would have been lost without you." Jane swallowed, looking away. "I'm just trying to survive." Like always, Liz shook her head. "No, this is more than that. You've given them a chance, and you've found a strength you didn't know you had." The words settled over Jane like a blanket, comforting and heavy. She wasn't used to compliments, to acknowledgement, but Liz's words stirred something inside her, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. The days at the cabin passed in tense silence, each one blending into the next as Jane and Liz adjusted to their new life. The babies were demanding, their cries filling the small cabin at all hours. Jane learned to feed them, to soothe them, to sing lullabies she barely remembered from her own childhood. Liz helped as much as she could, her presence a calming influence in the chaotic rhythm of their days. But the threat of discovery lingered, a shadow that refused to dissipate. Jane knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The world beyond the forest would come looking for them eventually, and when it did, they needed to be ready. Late one night, as Liz slept, Jane sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. She felt the weight of exhaustion, the relentless strain of vigilance, but she couldn't let her guard down. The forest was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. But in her mind, she heard the echoes of the city, the sirens, the voices, the footsteps of those who would come for her and the babies. She glanced at the infants, their faces peaceful in sleep, and felt a pang of fear mixed with fierce determination. She would protect them, no matter what. Even if it meant sacrificing everything, she would keep them safe. The sound of a twig snapping outside jolted her from her thoughts. Her heart raced as she peered into the darkness, her senses on high alert. For a moment, she saw nothing, but then, movement. A figure, moving stealthily among the trees, inching closer to the cabin. Panic surged through her. They had been found. Without a second thought, she rushed to wake Liz, her voice low and urgent. "Liz, someone's here. They found us." Liz's eyes snapped open, and she was on her feet in an instant, her expression grim. She grabbed the bundle of supplies they had prepared for emergencies, handing Jane a small flashlight and a map. "We need to go," Liz whispered, her voice steady. "Take the babies and head north along the path. I'll cover you." Jane's heart ached as she looked at Liz, the woman who had been her only friend, her only family. She wanted to protest, to insist they go together, but Liz's expression brooked no argument. "Go, Jane," Liz urged, her voice firm. "I'll meet you once I've thrown them off your trail. Just take care of those babies." With tears in her eyes, Jane nodded, gathering the infants into the stroller and slipping out the back door. The night swallowed her as she moved through the forest, her steps careful and quiet. She glanced back only once, catching a glimpse of Liz standing in the doorway, watching over her. The path was treacherous in the darkness, the stroller rattling over roots and stones, but Jane pressed on, her fear driving her forward. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a threat, but she forced herself to stay calm, to keep moving. As dawn approached, she reached a small clearing, her heart racing as she scanned the area. She was alone, but the silence felt ominous, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Hours passed, each one stretching into eternity as she waited for any sign of Liz. The babies slept fitfully, their tiny cries echoing in the stillness. Jane rocked them gently, whispering soothing words, her own heart heavy with worry. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jane heard footsteps, a single pair, approaching slowly. She tensed, ready to flee, but then she saw her, Liz, emerging from the shadows, her face pale and her clothes torn. Relief flooded Jane's chest, and she ran to her, wrapping her arms around her friend. Liz hugged her back, her voice a hoarse whisper. "They're relentless, Jane. We have to keep moving. They won't stop until they find us." Jane nodded, her resolve hardening. She had already given everything to protect these children, but now she knew that the fight had only just begun. As they continued on their journey, deeper into the wilderness, Jane felt a new determination settle within her. She would do whatever it took to keep those babies safe, to shield them from the darkness that hunted them. And as the stars lit up the night sky, Jane whispered a silent promise to the children in her care. She would protect them, no matter the cost. The journey into shadows. The stars twinkled above them, casting a dim glow on the forest path as Jane and Liz trudged deeper into the wilderness. Their breaths mingled in the cold night air, visible in soft puffs that drifted upwards before vanishing. Every step Jane took felt heavier, burdened by the exhaustion that pulled at her muscles and the relentless worry in her heart. She glanced down at the babies in the stroller, bundled tightly to shield them from the chill, their small faces calm despite the turmoil surrounding them. Liz walked ahead, her silhouette moving steadily through the shadows. She was silent, her posture tense, and Jane knew her friend was as frightened as she was, even if she didn't show it. They were alone now, entirely dependent on each other and the rugged path ahead. There was no going back to the life they once knew. The safety of even the barest familiarity was a memory now. As dawn broke, Jane felt her exhaustion deepen, the adrenaline of the night fading into a bone-deep weariness. They needed rest. "Liz," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "we have to stop. The babies need to sleep." Liz nodded, her eyes scanning their surroundings until she found a small clearing, shielded by thick bushes and twisted tree branches. "Here," she said, guiding Jane toward the clearing. They carefully settled the babies on a blanket, and Jane sat beside them, her body heavy with fatigue. Liz kept watch, her eyes alert, even as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. For the first time in hours, Jane felt a faint sense of relief. The world was quiet here, untouched by the chaos that had pursued them from the city. She closed her eyes, her head leaning back against the trunk of a tree, and felt sleep begin to creep over her. But peace was fleeting. She was jolted awake by the soft murmurs of the babies, their tiny hands grasping at the air, their cries weak and pleading. She pulled them close, her heart aching as she soothed them, whispering soft words of comfort until they settled back into a restless slumber. "They're hungry," Liz murmured, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "And we don't have enough supplies to last more than a few days." Jane nodded, her throat tightening. She knew that supplies were limited, that the small stash Liz had packed would run out soon. The forest, though a refuge, was no place to survive indefinitely. They needed food, and perhaps more urgently, they needed information. The unknown weighed heavily on them. How much Sam had uncovered. How far the people chasing them were willing to go. For all they knew, the entire city could be aware of their escape by now. "We need a plan," Jane whispered, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "We can't keep running blind." Liz's gaze softened, a mix of sorrow and admiration in her eyes. "You're right. But wherever we go, we have to be careful. This isn't just about the babies anymore. If they find us, well, there won't be mercy." Jane shivered, feeling the enormity of their situation settle over her, but she nodded. "Then we go further. We find somewhere safe and out of reach, somewhere they won't expect." Liz hesitated, as if weighing an unspoken thought. "There is one place, a place I never thought I'd return to. It's far from here, hidden deep in the mountains. My brother, he used to live there before he disappeared. No one knows about it, and it's off any official maps. It's a risk, but if we can reach it, we might be able to disappear for a while." Jane saw the pain in Liz's eyes, a flicker of memories she kept buried. But if Liz was willing to lead them there, it meant she believed it was their best hope. "How far is it?" Jane asked, her voice barely a whisper. 3 days' walk, maybe more, if we're careful." Liz took a deep breath. "But we'll need to stop in a village on the way. We'll need supplies, and we'll have to be fast. They might be watching towns, but they won't expect us in the middle of nowhere." It was risky, perhaps even reckless, but Jane felt a surge of determination. She couldn't afford to doubt, not when these children depended on her. "Then we go, tonight, after the babies have rested." The day passed slowly, each hour stretching as they took turns watching over the children and catching brief moments of sleep. Jane's mind was a constant swirl of worry and determination, each thought a reminder of what lay ahead. She found herself glancing at Liz, wondering about the brother she had mentioned, the place they were heading toward. Liz had always been a mystery, a figure of strength tempered by secrets she never shared. And now, as they ventured further into danger, Jane sensed that these secrets would become part of their journey. As dusk fell, they prepared to move again. Liz took the lead, guiding them along an overgrown path that wound through dense trees and rocky terrain. Jane kept close, pushing the stroller carefully over the uneven ground. The babies were quiet, their tiny breaths mingling with the sounds of the forest, a fragile reminder of what they were fighting for. They walked in silence for hours, the forest stretching endlessly around them, a labyrinth of trees and shadows. Jane's legs ached, her muscles protesting every step, but she forced herself to keep going, her resolve unbroken. She had come too far to give up now. Just before dawn, they'd reached the edge of a small village nestled in a valley, its lights flickering faintly against the darkened landscape. Jane felt a pang of fear. This was the most exposed they'd been since leaving the city. She glanced at Liz, who nodded reassuringly. "We'll be quick," Liz whispered, her eyes scanning the quiet streets. "I'll go alone. You stay here with the babies. If anything happens, if you see anyone suspicious, you run. Don't wait for me." Jane nodded, her heart pounding. She hated the idea of being separated, but she knew Liz was right. It was safer this way, even if the thought of waiting alone filled her with dread. Liz disappeared into the village, her figure fading into the shadows, leaving Jane to watch over the children. She huddled close to them, her eyes darting nervously around the clearing, every rustle of leaves making her flinch. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if unseen eyes lingered in the darkness, waiting for her to slip. Minutes felt like hours as she sat there, the weight of fear pressing down on her. She clutched the babies tightly, their warmth a small comfort in the cold night air. Just as she began to lose hope, she saw Liz returning, a small bundle of supplies clutched in her hands, her face tight with worry. "We need to go," Liz said urgently, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw someone in the village. They didn't see me, but they're here. They're looking for us." Jane's heart dropped, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Then we keep moving." They resumed their journey, slipping back into the shadows of the forest. With each step, Jane felt the tension in her body intensify, her senses heightened by the knowledge that their enemies were closer than ever. She glanced at the babies, their small faces peaceful despite the danger surrounding them, and felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. She would not let anyone take them. Not now. Not ever. As dawn approached, they reached a secluded area where the trees grew thick and tangled, forming a natural barrier that shielded them from view. Liz stopped, glancing around before nodding in approval. "We can rest here, just for a few hours." They settled in a small hollow hidden from sight by the dense foliage. Jane gently laid the babies down, covering them with blankets to keep them warm. She sat beside them, her body weary but her mind racing. Liz sat nearby, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her expression distant. After a long silence, Jane finally spoke. "Your brother, the place we're going to. Can you tell me about it?" Liz hesitated, her face shadowed with memories. "It was his sanctuary," she said softly. He was like us, always on the outskirts, never quite fitting in. When he found that place, he told me it was his escape, a place where no one could reach him." "What happened to him?" Jane asked, her voice gentle. Liz's gaze dropped, sadness flickering in her eyes. "He disappeared years ago. Went out for supplies one day and never came back. I searched for him, but it was as if he vanished. After a while, I had to accept that he wasn't coming back." Jane felt a pang of sorrow for Liz, for the loss she had carried alone. She reached out, placing a comforting hand on her friend's shoulder. "Thank you, Liz, for helping me, for risking everything." Liz managed a small smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We're all we've got, Jane. Out here, it's just us. And these little ones." She glanced at the babies, her expression softening. "They deserve a chance, a real chance." Jane nodded, her resolve hardening. She would fight for these children, even if it meant facing the darkness that had pursued them from the city. As the days passed, their journey grew more grueling. The path became steeper, the terrain more treacherous, and Jane's body ached from the constant strain. But she kept going, driven by a fierce determination to protect the babies. Liz guided them with quiet confidence, her knowledge of the forest an invaluable asset as they navigated the dense wilderness. Finally, on the 5th day, they reached the base of a mountain, its towering peaks shrouded in mist. Liz pointed to a narrow trail that wound up the mountainside, barely visible through the fog. "It's up there," she said, her voice weary but resolute. "The cabin. Once we reach it, we'll be safe." Jane felt a surge of relief mixed with trepidation. The climb would be difficult, especially with the babies, but they were close, so close to the refuge they so desperately needed. They began the ascent, each step a battle against the steep incline and their own exhaustion. Jane's muscles screamed in protest, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. But she pushed on, the babies her constant motivation. She could feel their tiny bodies nestled against her, their warmth a reminder of what she was fighting for. As they neared the summit, a sudden noise made them freeze. A distant shout, carried on the wind. Jane's heart stopped. Someone was following them. Liz's face hardened, her gaze sharp. "We have to move. Now." They quickened their pace, scrambling up the final stretch of the trail until, at last, they saw it. A small cabin, hidden among the rocks and trees, barely distinguishable from the mountain itself. Jane felt a rush of relief as they stumbled toward it, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. They entered the cabin, the air thick with the scent of wood and earth. It was small and worn, but it was shelter, a place to hide, to regroup. Liz bolted the door, her face grim. "We'll stay here for as long as we can," she said, her voice steady. "But we have to be ready. They're close, and they won't give up easily." Jane nodded, her heart heavy with fear, but her resolve unwavering. She looked down at the babies, their faces peaceful in sleep, and felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. She would not let them be taken, not by the people who wanted to use them, nor by the darkness that had haunted them for so long. As the sun set over the mountains, casting shadows across the cabin, Jane sat beside the babies, her heart filled with a silent promise. She would fight for them, protect them, no matter what it took. And as the night deepened, she knew that the real battle was only beginning. The night of reckoning. The mountain cabin felt like a fortress in the beginning, a secluded haven where Jane and Liz could finally catch their breath. The babies slept peacefully, nestled in a makeshift bed Jane had prepared in one corner, their soft breaths a reminder of what she was willing to sacrifice. They had barely survived the grueling journey up the mountainside, but they had arrived, hidden from the eyes of those who hunted them. Days passed with an eerie sense of calm. Liz gathered firewood, kept watch, and even managed to scavenge edible roots and berries from the surrounding forest. Jane focused on the children, their needs her sole concern as she adjusted to the rhythms of their small lives. In this sanctuary, with the thick forest and towering mountains surrounding them, they could almost pretend they were safe. Almost. But as each day melted into the next, Jane could feel the tension in her stomach deepen. She hadn't forgotten Sam's warning. "They're coming for you." Those words haunted her, surfacing in the quiet moments, filling her with dread. She glanced at Liz, who seemed to feel it too. They didn't speak about it, but they both knew this peace couldn't last. It was on the seventh night that everything changed. Jane had been struggling to sleep, her senses heightened by the quiet, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. She lay in bed, listening to the soft crackling of the fire and the gentle rustling of the wind against the cabin walls. Then she heard it, a faint sound, barely perceptible, but unmistakably human. Footsteps. Her heart stilled, her body tensing as she strained to hear. The footsteps grew louder, and she shot up, grabbing the small flashlight Liz had left beside her bed. She moved silently to the window, peering out into the darkness. Her blood ran cold. Shadows moved among the trees, advancing with calculated precision toward the cabin. She rushed to Liz, shaking her awake. Liz blinked, her eyes wide with immediate understanding. "They found us," Jane whispered, her voice trembling. Liz nodded, her expression fierce. "We knew this might happen. We need to stick to the plan." The plan. Liz had insisted they prepare for this night, had drilled Jane on what to do if they were discovered. But now, with the reality crashing down on her, Jane felt a surge of panic. She glanced at the babies, fast asleep, blissfully unaware of the danger. "Go," Liz urged, her voice steady. "Take the babies and follow the escape path out back. It'll lead you down the other side of the mountain. I'll cover for you." "No, Liz." Liz grabbed Jane's arm, her grip firm. "Listen to me. This is the only way. They'll expect all of us to flee together. If I stay behind, I can buy you time." Jane's throat tightened, tears prickling her eyes. "I can't leave you here. They'll kill you." Liz's gaze softened, but her voice remained firm. "Jane, I've lived my life. Those babies haven't even had a chance to start theirs. You have to do this. For them. For you. Go now." Before Jane could protest further, Liz pulled her into a fierce embrace and then pushed her toward the children. Jane moved numbly, her body obeying while her heart rebelled. She gently lifted each baby, wrapping them tightly in blankets, her hands trembling as she cradled their small, warm bodies. The knowledge that this might be the last time she saw Liz clawed at her insides, but Liz's eyes left no room for doubt. "Run, Jane," Liz whispered, her voice breaking. "Run and don't look back." With a final, wrenching look, Jane turned and slipped out the back door, the cold night air wrapping around her like a shroud. She heard Liz bolting the door behind her, and then silence. She couldn't dwell on the thought of what Liz would face. She had to focus on the children, on the narrow trail that snaked down the mountainside. She forced herself forward, her footsteps light and swift as she navigated the path. The night was silent save for the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. She glanced back only once, seeing the faint glow of the cabin in the distance, her heart twisting as she imagined Liz standing alone, ready to face their enemies. The path was treacherous, winding steeply down the side of the mountain, littered with loose rocks and overgrown roots. Jane moved carefully, cradling the babies close to her chest, their weight a constant reminder of her purpose. Each step was a battle, her muscles straining under the load, but she pushed on, driven by the thought of Liz's sacrifice. Hours passed, the darkness finally giving way to the first light of dawn, casting a dim glow over the rugged landscape. Jane stumbled on, her mind a blur of exhaustion and fear, her body on the edge of collapse. But she couldn't stop, not yet. She had to put as much distance between herself and the cabin as possible. Finally, she reached a small clearing near the base of the mountain. She sank to her knees, her breaths coming in ragged gasps, as she gently laid the babies down, her hands shaking from the effort of holding them for so long. She collapsed beside them, her body aching, her mind numb. But even as she rested, she knew she couldn't linger here. The people hunting them would search every inch of the mountain, and it was only a matter of time before they found her trail. She had to keep moving. After a few minutes, she forced herself to her feet, cradling the babies once more as she scanned the landscape. She spotted a narrow path leading into a dense forest, its shadows deep and inviting. It was risky, but it offered cover, a chance to disappear. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the path, her body moving on instinct as she plunged into the darkness of the trees. The forest was thick, the canopy overhead blocking out most of the light, casting the path in shadows. But she pressed on, her footsteps muffled by the soft earth, her ears straining for any sound that might signal danger. By midday, she had made her way deep into the forest, the trees towering around her like silent sentinels. She found a small stream, its water clear and cold, and stopped to drink, letting the babies sip carefully from the edge of a cloth she dampened. They were surprisingly calm, their quiet innocence a stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed their lives. As she sat by the stream, she allowed herself a moment to think of Liz. The pain was sharp, cutting through her exhaustion, but she forced herself to stay focused. Liz had given her this chance, and she wouldn't let it be in vain. She would survive. She would protect these children, no matter the cost. Just as she was preparing to continue, she heard a noise, a faint rustling in the trees behind her. Her heart leaped, her body tensing as she scanned the forest. She saw movement, a figure slipping through the trees, moving with quiet precision. Panic surged through her. They had found her. Without a second thought, she scooped up the babies and sprinted deeper into the forest, her footsteps quick and silent as she weaved through the trees. She could hear footsteps behind her, gaining on her, their pace steady and relentless. She pushed herself harder, her breaths coming in short gasps, her muscles screaming in protest. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing in around her. But she kept running, her body fueled by sheer determination. She could hear the footsteps growing fainter, her pursuers losing ground as she slipped further into the shadows. Finally, she stumbled into a thicket, collapsing to the ground as she gasped for breath. She held the babies close, their warmth a small comfort in the cold, and listened. The footsteps were gone, the forest silent once more. She had escaped for now, but she knew they would keep searching, would follow her trail until they found her. She had to stay hidden, had to keep moving. For days, Jane moved through the forest, surviving on the small supplies Liz had given her, and the edible plants and berries she managed to find. She kept the babies close, their needs her constant focus as they navigated the wilderness. Every night, she found a new place to hide, her sleep shallow and filled with the fear of discovery. On the fifth night, as she lay beside the babies in a small cave she had found, she heard a sound that made her heart freeze. It was a voice, distant but unmistakable, a man calling out her name, his tone soft and coaxing. "Jane," he called, his voice drifting through the trees. "We know you're out here. We know you're tired. Just come out. No one has to get hurt." Jane's blood ran cold. She recognized that voice. One of the men from the city, a face she'd seen in the shadows during her encounters with Sam. They were close, closer than ever, and they were trying to draw her out. She held her breath, her body pressed against the cold stone of the cave, her heart pounding. The babies shifted beside her, their tiny bodies warm against her own, and she tightened her hold on them, praying they would stay silent. The man continued to call her name, his voice smooth, almost gentle. But Jane could hear the malice beneath it, the threat that lurked just beneath the surface. "We're not here to hurt you, Jane," he called, his tone deceptively calm. "We just want to talk. We just want the babies back." Jane's jaw clenched. She knew what they wanted, knew they wouldn't stop until they had the children. But she also knew she couldn't let them have them. These babies were more than pawns in some twisted game of power. They were innocent lives, and she had sworn to protect them. She waited, her body tense, until the voice faded, until the forest returned to its eerie silence. Only then did she allow herself to relax, her body sagging with relief. But she knew they would return, knew they would search every inch of the forest until they found her. She had to keep moving. There was no other choice. As dawn broke over the forest, Jane rose, gathering the babies and preparing to continue their journey. Her body was weary, her mind frayed, but she forced herself forward, each step a testament to her determination. With every mile, every step, she drew closer to a place she had never known, a place of safety, a place of peace. And as she moved through the shadows, the children nestled against her, she made a silent promise. She would reach that place, no matter the cost. And she would protect these children, even if it meant facing the darkness that hunted them alone. The final stand. The dawn light filtered through the dense canopy of the forest, casting a faint glow over Jane's path. Her legs ached from days of constant movement, her arms numb from carrying the babies, yet she pushed forward. The silence of the forest pressed around her, broken only by the occasional murmur of a distant bird. The forest's quiet was both a blessing and a curse, for while it shielded her from the eyes of her pursuers, it also hid them in its shadows. The night before, the man's voice had lingered in her mind, a chilling reminder of how close they were. He had called her name, tempting her to surrender, but Jane had known better than to trust his words. She had seen the cruelty in those people's eyes, felt the malice in their intent. They were hunters, and she was the quarry. But these children, they were the prize, and she was the only shield between them and those who sought to exploit them. Jane pressed onward, her senses sharp as she navigated the twisting path that led deeper into the forest. She knew she couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, she would have to face them, to make a final stand. The weight of that realization settled over her like a shroud, yet a fierce determination burned within her. She would not let them take the children. Not now, not ever. The babies stirred in her arms, their small bodies warm against the chill of the morning air. She felt a pang of love mixed with fear as she looked at their innocent faces. They had become her family, her purpose, and in a way they had saved her as much as she had saved them. These 12 children, each one fragile, each one vulnerable, had given her a reason to fight. As the sun climbed higher, Jane caught sight of a structure hidden among the trees. It was an old hunting lodge, abandoned and overgrown, its wooden walls weathered and cracked from years of neglect. She paused, assessing its sturdiness, and decided it would serve as a temporary refuge. They needed a break, a moment to regroup before deciding on their next move. She entered the lodge, her heart pounding as she scanned the interior. It was a single room, empty save for a crumbling fireplace, and a few broken chairs. The air was thick with the scent of decay, yet it was safe, hidden from the world. She gently set the babies down, arranging them on a blanket she had managed to salvage from the cabin. They lay quietly, their small bodies exhausted from the journey, their breaths steady and calm. Jane moved to the window, her eyes scanning the forest beyond. The shadows seemed to shift, as if watching her, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. Her enemies were out there, somewhere, closing in on her with each passing day. She knew that hiding would only delay the inevitable. Eventually, they would find her. Her mind drifted to Liz, to the memory of her friend standing alone in the cabin, ready to face the danger so that Jane and the children could escape. The thought brought tears to her eyes, but she pushed them away, swallowing the grief that threatened to consume her. Liz had made her choice, and Jane would honor her sacrifice by protecting the children, by surviving. Hours passed as Jane rested, her eyes never straying far from the window. She knew she couldn't linger here for long. The hunters would be thorough, combing every inch of the forest until they found her. But her body was exhausted, her mind frayed, and she needed a plan. She thought of Sam, the journalist who had promised to expose the truth, to shine a light on the darkness that had swallowed her life. She wondered if he had managed to publish the story, if anyone in the city knew of the horrors these children had endured. A sudden sound snapped her from her thoughts, a twig snapping outside the lodge, the faint murmur of voices. Her heart raced as she moved to the window, peering through the broken glass. Shadows flickered among the trees, moving with a quiet precision that sent a chill down her spine. They were here. She turned to the babies, her mind racing as she considered her options. She could try to run, to slip through the trees and lose them in the forest, but she knew she wouldn't get far. Her strength was waning, and the children were too fragile for another desperate flight. No, this time, she would have to stand her ground. Jane scanned the room, her eyes landing on an old iron poker resting by the fireplace. She grabbed it, feeling its weight in her hand, the cold metal a small comfort in the face of the danger that lurked outside. She had never fought anyone before, had never imagined she would be forced to defend her life and the lives of others. But these past days had changed her, forged her into someone she barely recognized, a woman willing to fight, to protect, to sacrifice. The voices grew louder, closer, and she heard footsteps approaching the lodge. She held her breath, gripping the poker tightly, her body tense as she waited. She couldn't see them yet, but she could feel their presence, a dark energy pressing in on her, filling the room with an oppressive weight. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. A tall man with a cold expression, his eyes scanning the room with a predatory gleam. His gaze landed on her, a smirk curling at the corner of his lips. "Jane," he said softly, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You've led us on quite a chase, but it's over now. Just hand over the babies, and we'll make this easy for you." Jane felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness that drove away her fear. She stood tall, the poker raised in her hand, her voice steady as she spoke. "I won't let you take them. Not now, not ever." The man chuckled, shaking his head as he took a step closer. "Do you really think you can stop us? You're outnumbered, outmatched. You're just a homeless woman with a misplaced sense of purpose." "Maybe," Jane replied, her grip tightening on the poker. "But I have something you don't." He raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in his eyes. "And what's that?" "Something worth fighting for." Without warning, she lunged forward, swinging the poker with all her strength. The man dodged, his expression turning from amusement to annoyance as he sidestepped her attack. He grabbed her arm, twisting it painfully, and Jane gasped, struggling against his grip. But she didn't relent. She kicked at his shins, twisting her body as she fought to free herself. The babies stirred behind her, their cries filling the room as they sensed her distress, and the sound fueled her, filling her with a fierce determination. The man cursed, shoving her back, and she stumbled, barely managing to keep her balance. She raised the poker again, her breath ragged, her body trembling, but her resolve unwavering. "You're wasting your time," he sneered, drawing a knife from his belt. "Just give up, Jane. It's over." Jane felt a flash of fear as she saw the blade, but she pushed it aside, her focus narrowing to a single point. She couldn't let him reach the children. She had to hold him off, to protect them, no matter the cost. The man lunged at her, the knife flashing in the dim light, and Jane swung the poker, deflecting the blade with a desperate cry. They struggled, their movements a blur of fury and desperation, each one fighting for control. Just as Jane felt her strength beginning to wane, she heard a sound, a faint rustling outside the lodge. Her heart leaped as she realized what it meant. Reinforcements. Liz had told her about the escape route, about the people who might help if they were ever in trouble. The man heard it too, his face twisting in anger as he glanced toward the door. Jane seized the moment, slamming the poker into his side with all her remaining strength. He stumbled, cursing as he fell back, his knife clattering to the floor. The door burst open, and a group of figures entered, their faces grim and determined. Jane recognized one of them, Sam, the journalist, his eyes fierce as he took in the scene. He rushed forward, grabbing the man and pinning him to the ground, his expression cold. "Jane," he said, his voice steady, "are you all right?" She nodded, her body sagging with relief as she lowered the poker. The baby's cries had subsided. Their small bodies nestled together, safe and unharmed. She sank to her knees beside them, her hands trembling as she brushed her fingers over their tiny faces. Sam approached, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "You did it, Jane. You kept them safe." Tears filled her eyes, a mixture of relief and exhaustion flooding over her as she looked up at him. "I couldn't let them take them. I promised, Liz, I'd protect them." He nodded, his expression somber. "And you did. You fought for them, and you won." Jane glanced at the babies, her heart swelling with love and pride as she watched them sleep, their faces peaceful and unmarked by the horrors they had endured. She had fought for them, had faced dangers she never thought she could survive, and in the end, she had kept her promise. Sam helped her to her feet, his arm steady around her as he guided her outside. The forest was quiet, the danger finally gone, and Jane felt a peace settle over her, a sense of closure she had never known. As they walked away from the lodge, Jane knew that her life had changed forever. She had found something she had never thought possible, a purpose, a family, a reason to fight. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she was ready to face it, to embrace the future with open arms. Because in the end, she had discovered that true strength wasn't in running or hiding, but in standing up for those who couldn't stand for themselves. And as she held the children close, she knew that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be.